I'm Jasmine Al Gamal, and this is The View from Here. I wanted to start this season with a topic that has been severely underreported in the media and underprioritized by governments, and that is Sudan. Sudan has been in the headlines recently after the city of el-Fasher was captured by the RSF, the Rapid Support Forces, one of two parties, the other being the Sudanese Armed Forces, to a conflict that has ravaged the country in unimaginable ways. More than 150,000 people have died in the conflict across the country, and about 12 million have fled their homes in what the United Nations has called the world's largest humanitarian crisis. But this didn't just happen overnight. For many months, everyone from Sudanese activists and journalists to the UN has been warning of the exact scenario we see unfolding today. So what happened? Why were all these warnings ignored? Why didn't anyone do anything? And what were some of the historic and structural factors in Sudan that allowed this moment to unfold? I spoke to Khulud Khair, a Sudanese political analyst and the founding director of Confluence Advisory, a think and do tank based in Khartoum, to unpack the issues for us and tell us what both policymakers and ordinary people can do to help. Khulud Khair, thank you so much for joining us on The View from Here. I'm so happy to have you with us.
Thank you, Yasmin.
I wanted to ask you first, because obviously Sudan is an issue that for so long has been underreported, underprioritized, and now all of a sudden, because of the horrific nature of the scenes that we're seeing coming out of el-Fasher, we're seeing an uptick in the reporting on Sudan. But before we get into what's actually happening now, I want you to, if you can, just give us a sense of the country that you know and the people that you know.
So Sudan is, a country that was pieced together really through colonial adventure and misadventure. Darfur didn't become part of what is today Sudan until about 1916. And what is today South Sudan, that was once part of Sudan, we didn't really have access between the North and the South until about 1922, because when the British had control over Sudan, they effectively closed off what is today South Sudan, and therefore helped to create this distance culturally, geographically, etc., which was then, very much expounded on by later governments and successive governments during independence. But so if you can think about it, sort of this amalgamation of different areas.
Yeah.
And today's battle fault lines that we can see very much fit that. And in large part, that's because, yes, the colonial project really sort of segregated Sudan when it pieced it together. It never really made it a whole. But one of our enduring problems, political problems in Sudan, is that there's never really been a government-led, state-led, nation-building project that looked at inclusive citizenship, that looked at, inclusive sort of culture and religious background, etc. And that is why you have such a long history of war in Sudan. But our biggest problem is that Sudan's politics has been so militarized for so long, which means that the only way that some groups find to contest the state, and often these are ethnic groups, is to pick up arms, right? They can't go to the ballot box and contest the state there. They can't try and go for local politics and try to change things at the local governance level. Everything was decided in Khartoum. Everything was rubber stamped in Khartoum, even if the production areas of Sudan were Darfur, the Kordofans to the southwest, the Blue Nile and southeast, different parts of the country, even to the far north and the agricultural hubs of the east. All of it had to go in through Khartoum very much in this centralized colonial way. And so those vestiges of colonialism that we can never really shrug off as a country, very much supported by successive military regimes, because of course centralized power helps you to centralize rules, helps you to centralize the entire sort of political and economic project and keep the incumbents in power. Despite all this, though, there's so much in Sudan, that's sort of politically exciting. We've had 3 revolutions, which is very much unlike many countries, not just in the region, sort of the Middle East and North Africa and Africa as a whole, but also, internationally. There are very few countries that have had, 3 revolutions in 60 years. 3 successful revolutions. And actually, it's only been, despite the decades and decades of military rule, despite the decades and decades of armed conflict, it's only ever been unarmed, non-violent, civilian protests and civilian movements that have ever really unseated a military, autocratic, authoritarian dictatorship. And so there's a lot in Sudan to be proud of. I think people from the outside look at Sudan and they say, isn't that the place that consistently has famines and military governments and
Right.
genocides? And, the first genocide of the 21st century was in Sudan, in Darfur, in the early 2000s. Sudan today has the world's largest humanitarian crisis, the world's largest hunger crisis, the world's
Right.
largest displacement crisis, and the world's largest protection crisis. And that's all people ever see. But what keeps Sudan together, despite all the problems I just outlined, what puts Sudan in a position and Sudanese people in a position to really come together and push back against authoritarian military rule, is this common shared sense of belonging that people have, despite the state assiduously trying to push back against that. A lot of what is forged in Sudan is often in spite of the state. And there's such a strong social fabric in Sudan that has kept Sudan, and Sudanese people enduring, really, for the worst of our crises.
Absolutely. As I'm listening to you describe it and watching everything happening now, it's such a testament to the resilience and that spirit of you're wanting to take back your country. You're wanting to make it better. You're wanting to move away from that militarized, securitized system of governance that you just talked about. But the odds are so strongly against people who try to do that. And it comes at such a high cost, whether it's activists or journalists, people like yourself who've been writing about this and working on this for so long, people who protested and had such high hopes for a different future. What is the role, for example, of someone like Omar al-Bashir in terms of entrenching that militarization that you talked about? And what damage did he do while he was in power? And do you see any of that damage still remaining today?
Absolutely. I mean, I think one thing is, if you look at this historical longue durée in Sudan, is that you see that the bouts of military rule have only gotten longer, and the bouts of democratic rule or sort of civilian rule have only gotten shorter.
Yeah.
And so we had the first dictatorship under General Aboud lasted 9 years, and then we had 16 years under General Nimeri, and then we had 29, almost 30 years under Bashir. So really sort of exponential, sort of as you go from one to the next, which means that these dictators are effectively learning
Yes.
from the previous experiences of dictatorship and learning how to do it better, if you will, and stay in power longer, which means invariably a more authoritarian turn.
Yeah.
And Bashir really perfected this. The security system or the security regime that was started under Nimeri in sort of the 70s and 80s really became perfected by the Bashir regime, because he didn't just come into power through a military regime. He came into power through the Muslim Brotherhood. And the Islamist rule at the time was already very securitized. The Islamists had been, rejected by the Sudanese for decades and decades and decades. Started out in the 40s, and throughout the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, people rejected them. It was only when Jafar Nimeri sort of brought them into power, because he needed them really to access funding in the Gulf, in particular Saudi Arabia, etc., in the 70s, and have access to some of that Islamic finance, because he ran the economy so poorly. And that allowed the Islamists a foothold into Sudanese politics that they've been very jealously guarding ever since. And so the Bashir regime came into power with the National Islamic Front, led by Hassan al-Turabi. And the two of them together really led this, what they saw as a civilizational project of Sudan, which meant that they had to change everything, violently change everything, agricultural and agrarian systems, economic systems, social services, etc. Destroyed, if you will, the public sector, the civil service, relatively meritocratic, although with huge caveats, system that was there at the time. Sudan has not been able to recover from. A lot of the changes that were made under the Islamo military regime of Omar al-Bashir have been very difficult to fix. And that was, of course, by design.
Absolutely.
And so what we saw in 1999, just the advent of the oil boom, was the National Islamic Front split. And so Bashir went his own way, Turabi went his own way, formed his own party, the Popular Congress Party. But Bashir stayed in power, consolidated his regime even more, brought in the Janjaweed, which are now the RSF, closer into power in Khartoum. He solidified them later on, and under an act of parliament, made them an official part of the security service in 2017. During the Bashir regime, you could really sort of trace a very neoliberal slant all the political changes. Very small government, i.e. very few services, very little infrastructure development, etc., but a huge boom in the private sector. So education became highly privatized. Healthcare became highly privatized. Even war became highly privatized. The government, the Sudanese Armed Forces, were doing less and less. And the Sudanese Armed Forces were farming out or outsourcing a lot of the fighting to militias, ethnic militias like the Janjaweed, which became the RSF, but as well as other groups such as the Popular Defense Forces, Islamist groups effectively, etc. The Bashir regime also saw a period of engagement with extremist groups in the region, all over particularly the Middle Eastern region. The Bashir regime also oversaw the funding of and support to rebel movements and armed militias in neighboring countries.
Mhm.
They supported a coup in Chad. It was a hugely destructive and destabilizing regime, not just for Sudan, but for the region as a whole. But they managed to last a very, very long time. And that's because they weakened the opposition. They imprisoned and tortured anybody who stood up against them, gave out pieces of the state that they'd broken off and privatized to their loyalists. They'd enriched those who were allied with the Sudanese Armed Forces or parts of the Sudanese Armed Forces. They completely changed the structure of the state. They completely changed the structure of the civil service, the army, etc. And they impoverished and emaciated whatever civic structures there were in Sudan, which is why the response to the Bashir regime and what eventually unseated him was the kind of grassroots mobilizing that could counteract the deep penetration of the Islamists into Sudanese society and politics. Just goes to show, for example, when you look at 1964, 1985, two previous revolutions, it took a few days to a week and a half in those two instances to bring down the dictatorship. In 2018, it took about 5 months to bring down Bashir and then another few months of protests to get fulsome, or as fulsome as possible, military change. The Bashir regime left an indelible mark on Sudan, and actually because right now, the Sudanese Armed Forces and the Rapid Support Forces, both key parts of the security state under Bashir, are fighting it out and sucking in other armed groups, sucking in ethnic constituencies into this war. You could say that the Bashir regime is still very much at the forefront of Sudanese politics because this war is an expression of its demise. This war is an expression of the ambitions of some of the security sector under Bashir of coming back into power and really having total control over Sudanese politics and the economy.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so glad you said it that way because it really sounds like a lot of what happened under al-Bashir and what he did. First of all, the typical authoritarian playbook, right? Consolidate power in the hands of a few, make alliances that are based on mutual interests, not really thinking about the long-term impact of any of that, just consolidating control, weakening institutions, making it really difficult for people to organize, do something different. So what we're seeing now, and you've talked about the Sudanese Armed Forces and the RSF, which are the Rapid Support Forces. As with any conflict, there's so much disinformation out there. So many people are trying to control the narrative based on their interests and what they want people to know. You see influencers making videos, just putting out completely misleading information in so many different ways. And so I really wanted you to try to set the record straight for us. I mean, you've already given us an idea of how this started and where the roots of the conflict, the roots of the rivalry between the Sudanese Armed Forces and the RSF, the Rapid Support Forces. They are now fighting each other, but that wasn't always the case, right? And so can you talk us through why are they fighting each other now? What do each of them want and who is supporting them?
The one thing too, I think, help frame this conflict is to think of it as a counter-revolutionary war. The timing of this war is very much linked to how successful the revolution was and how successful the transitional period, despite its many problems, was proving to be. Sudan, under the transitional period, under civilian rule, was able to bring Sudan out from pariah status as a state sponsor of terror, as a country that hosted bin Laden in the 90s, as the country that was very much part of countries that were supporting destabilization, terror activities, etc. During the civilian period, that was becoming a thing of the past. Sudan was finally able to sort of shrug off all of those terrible labels at that time, and the generals frankly got scared. And they realized that they would not be able to claim back power, which I guess was something they'd always wanted to do after their little transitional period experiment. And they realized that they wanted to make sure that they would keep their troops, they would keep their money, ill-gotten gains, that they will not be put under any kind of justice or accountability mechanism that might see them lose their heads, or worse, as far as they're concerned, be sent to the ICC, which would withdraw for them round humiliation. And those three things really are what brought together Burhan and Hemeti, Burhan is the head of Sudanese Armed Forces, Hemeti is the head of the Rapid Support Forces, brought them together. I think it's less accurate to say that it was a coup and more accurate to say there was an auto golpe. They were already in power. They just kicked out the civilian element that they were sharing power within the hybrid government and consolidated power amongst themselves. Then, of course, could not agree on how to consolidate this coup of theirs in 2021. Do they go the Egyptian route, where they just have quickie elections, which they will rig and then stay in power? Or do they have a different route that will try and refocus the center of power away from Khartoum to other different constituencies? And that is really what started some of these problems between them. Then they had very technical issues around, would the RSF be integrated into Sudanese Armed Forces? How long would it take? Would that take 10 years or would it take 2 years? And the SAF wanted it to take 2 years and wanted it as quickly as possible to bring the RSF into their command. And the Rapid Support Forces wanted to keep their political options open. And so they wanted to go for 10 years, by which time they'd be able to get their house in order, assert their power in areas of interest, and then perhaps look at this sort of integration model. But well before we saw these tensions between them rise, we saw SAF and the RSF really work together very much in terms of the Darfur genocide of the early 2000s. General Burhan was in Darfur, central Darfur state, I believe, where he and Janjaweed at the time really worked together to plan and attack the people of Darfur, in particular some of the armed groups in Darfur, or rebel group movements as they call them, in Darfur at the time. So we did see them effectively go from brothers in arms to then, the worst of enemies. And that transition happened because they could never really reconcile their thirst for total power, right? SAF wanted total power. The RSF felt that they had served the Sudanese state enough that they should get access, actually, to the spoils of war, which they saw as the Sudanese state. In order to unseat Bashir in 2019, after so much popular support to getting rid of Bashir and the Islamist regime, the Sudanese Armed Forces realized that even though they had some schisms with this RSF, RSF soldiers were paid more, RSF soldiers became the darlings of Bashir, they didn't want to share power or political favor with them. But they saw that in order to survive, for the Sudanese Armed Forces and the idea of a militarist project to survive in Sudan, they would have to join forces with the RSF even more, and in Khartoum, in the capital, in the center. So the Sudanese Armed Forces brought General Hemeti and the RSF much closer into power. They gave him the role of vice president, in effect. And through that, he was able to entrench himself in Khartoum, in the central economy, not just the Darfur economy or the transnational economy in the Sahel. And really, that is what allowed Hemeti to have this foothold in the center that made him, shoot for the whole cake, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
He no longer was going to be satisfied with scraps from Khartoum related to power in Darfur and elsewhere. And we see actually echoes of this today during the war. But the triggers around the war were that there was going to be a framework agreement that was going to finally be signed, and that final agreement was going to usher in a return to civilian rule after the coup of 2021. Of course, neither SAF nor RSF wanted that coup to be righted. They didn't want to see a return to civilian rule. And so the war broke out, to me, yes, between SAF and the RSF, very much in this power struggle, but very much the timing suggests against this idea of a return to civilian rule. So I see it very much as a counter-revolutionary war, and we see this in how many people have died. If you look at the groups of people that have died, it is far more ordinary civilians than it is members of SAF or the RSF. When you look at within the civilian groupings, the types of people that have been killed, detained, arrested, disappeared, it is organized civil society groups, doctor groups, journalist syndicate, resistance committees, the neighborhood groups that brought down the Bashir regime. Today, emergency response rooms, mutual aid, first responders in the humanitarian sphere, they are targeting these groups that were central to the idea of civilian rule, that are central to a democratic Sudan, whilst they're fighting each other. And of course, the war has become so ethnicized because, I was in Khartoum when the war started. And I remember a lot of the conversations people were having, whether within sort of the politicians or within the civil society or just, ordinary people that you would meet in the queue to get bread during those first few weeks of war, they would say, this war really doesn't concern us. This war is between Burhan and Hemeti, who, because of their egos, can't share power. And so we'll just wait this out. We'll just sit this out, see what happens between them, and we'll deal with whatever comes next. It was obvious that there was going to be no victor. Neither SAF nor RSF could overcome the other. But whatever happens, we would just, as civil society, as civilians, deal with whatever came next. And of course, SAF and RSF quickly realized this. This war was going to be quite irrelevant to the people of Sudan unless they very quickly ethnicized it. And that's exactly what happened. So SAF started to increase its foothold amongst ethnic communities, particularly in the north, center, and east of Sudan. The RSF continued to cultivate the constituencies it had in places like Darfur and Kordofan to the southwest of the country. And because of that, very quickly, what was a war between two factions of the Sudanese security state became an all-out war across Sudan.
I mean, basically what you're describing is they're trying to get rid of anyone who will stand in their way of continued dominance and continued power. And because that encompasses so many different people and so many different groups, a lot of whom you just described, the death toll, the damage done is immense. We've talked about some of the numbers. We've talked about the fact that this is the largest humanitarian crisis in the world, the refugee crisis. We're looking at famine. We're looking at starvation, all of these horrific impacts of this fighting between them. And I was looking at an article you wrote actually last year in September. It was in Time magazine. I'm going to link this in the episode notes for everyone to read. And the title was, "The World Once Tried to Stop a Genocide in Sudan. Now it looks away." That was a full year ago when you were saying people are looking away. You're not paying attention to what's happening. This is happening. And you were saying that time that what was happening in Sudan was worse than the genocide in 2006. El-Fasher at the time, which has just fallen to the RSF, was surrounded. It was under siege by the RSF. A UN special advisor on the prevention of genocide said at the time, and I'm quoting here, "It is unquestionable that risk factors and indicators for genocide and related crimes are present in el-Fasher, and the risks are increasing." This is all 1 year ago.
Mm-hmm.
So when we look at these horrifying scenes today, there have been so many people, by the way, and this is terrible to even say, but there are so many people who have been killed that blood and bodies are visible from space. We're seeing satellite images of the damage that's being done now. And you just can't help thinking, we told you this was going to happen. We told you. So how did we get here? How did we get from the warnings that you and others were putting out in the media, writing articles and op-eds about this, to where we are now? In the last year, what have your conversations been like with policymakers, with journalists, with activists, to try to get it to sink in what was happening in real time before it got to the place where we are today?
In a word, frustrating. Those conversations that I and many others have been having for 18 months now. That's how long the RSF has been besieging el-Fasher. Those conversations all basically saying the same thing. We're going to see in el-Fasher what we saw in el-Jineina 2 years ago at the start of the war. We're going to see in el-Fasher what we saw 20 years ago, but much worse. What we're dealing with today is an RSF that is not just a ramshackle group of people on horseback, on camelback. We're seeing tanks, we're seeing artillery, we're seeing much more sophisticated weaponry, we're seeing drones that can travel 2,000 kilometers. And because of that, the kinds of violence that we're going to see, the kind of atrocity violence we're going to see, are going to be far worse in terms of scale than anything we saw in the early 2000s. And actually, when you speak to survivors of the Darfur genocide in the early 2000s, those of whom are either still in Sudan or have recently left Sudan, or those who still have family in Sudan, in Darfur specifically, they say what we're hearing now, what we're seeing now, what we're going through now is so much worse than we had gone through 20 years ago. And you have to remember that in and around el-Fasher is the symbolic and historic capital of the entire Darfur region, which is today 5 states. And in and around el-Fasher, internally displaced people's camps or IDP camps that have been around for 20 plus years since that first genocide. And what we saw early stages of this particular round of war, so June, July, up to sort of November, kinds of genocidal violence and atrocity violence that we saw 20 years ago. And this time around, the violence we're seeing in el-Fasher is very much similar to that. It's the same perpetrators with pretty much the same victims groups following the same kinds of systematic killing, with a lot of not so heavily coded language that they're using, very much ethnicized. It was so clear that that's where we're heading, and anybody who says they didn't see this coming is lying. Because, quite frankly, whether it's because I or others have spoken to them, diplomats, decision makers, whoever it is, or because they themselves could see how clear as day this pattern of violence is. They all knew it was coming. And they all now hide behind this, well, there was not much we could do. There was a report in The Guardian that came out to say that the United Kingdom had taken the position that actually just didn't have the finances or the manpower, the staff within Whitehall to really do anything about this, even though they knew very much that it was coming. I myself, along with others, went to Whitehall in April of last year, 2024, to speak about what was going to happen in el-Fasher. And then, as you say, I wrote that piece in Time, sort of this time last year, again, warning about this. That's just two instances. There are countless others where I and others like me, analysts, etc., have spoken to the powers that be to speak about exactly what we would be expecting. And there's so many others, the Yale Conflict Observatory that's giving a lot of the visual evidence of what we are hearing from the ground right now. They have been warning about this for 18 months as well. Human rights groups, international ones like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, etc., or local documenters, and these are the most important people, local documenters on the ground that have been saying, look, we're seeing signs of this, we're seeing that we're heading in this way. There's no shortage of evidence that could have shown us where we were heading. So there's really no excuse. At the same time, we're in a situation where, 20 years ago, when Colin Powell, the then Secretary of State of the United States, went to the United Nations and said there's a genocide happening, that was 2004, that triggered something. The international community rallied to put together a protection of civilians plan, which then became a peacekeeping mission. It was one of the largest peacekeeping missions in the world at the time and lasted for quite some time, about almost 15 years or so. And when people said the word famine, there are these international protocols that are triggered to respond to the famine. Today, there's both a famine in el-Fasher and there's also, of course, these atrocity crimes taking place. And none of that is moving anyone in the international community to move anything forward. Now, when we have warned about the fact that this was going to happen and there did need to be some protection of civilians mechanisms put in place beforehand, in anticipation of all this, those were effectively blocked. We were told the UN Security Council is too polarized at the time under the Biden administration because of the Russia and the United States' position on the Ukraine-Russia conflict. There was nothing that was going to move. And then later on, because of the US's position on Gaza, nothing was going to move either because there was just so much polarization that was pulling different superpowers in different directions at the Security Council. But it was also true that the Sudanese Armed Forces, which has as the sort of de facto authorities a permanent representative or an ambassador at the UN, he's been working really hard with countries like Russia, China, Algeria to effectively stop any talk of a peacekeeping mission or any talk of any kind of internationally mandated protection of civilians forces, because as the Sudanese Armed Forces says, this is an infringement on Sudan's sovereignty. But of course, they themselves have not put forward any kind of tangible protection of civilians plan either. And actually, 2 days before el-Fasher fell, the Sudanese Armed Forces negotiated with the RSF an exit for themselves, at least the senior officials in the Sudanese Armed Forces and the senior officials of the local government, the North Darfur state government. And so they effectively left civilians to it. They left civilians to die at the hands of the RSF, and they themselves knew that this is what the RSF was capable of. They have watched them do this before. They have helped them do this before. And so what you have is a situation in Sudan, and this is why I often frame this war as a war on civilians, is that it is civilians who are bearing the brunt for the mistakes of the international community, for the neglect and recklessness of the international community, for the avarice of Sudanese armed groups, for the recklessness by whichever governmental institutions do exist in Sudan are conducting affairs. And there's no protective wedge whatsoever between ordinary Sudanese people, whether it's el-Fasher or elsewhere, and the armed groups that mean to hurt them, in this particular case, the RSF. So it's a very desperate situation, and all of the international tools and frameworks we used to have 20 years ago either no longer exist or just are not fit for purpose, and the world has not seen fit to introduce new or reformed or updated tools that might be able to save human life.
There's so many thoughts going through my head when I hear you talk about this. And I think what you're doing right now is that you're helping people understand a lot of what happens behind the scenes in policy circles, in rooms where policy is made and where decisions are made. And you're also highlighting the weaknesses and the shortcomings of the international system that is supposed to be protecting human beings exactly at these times. I was just at Cambridge University 2 nights ago, and I was speaking to students about the Middle East and US policy in the Middle East. And one of the students asked me about the United Nations. And he said, why hasn't the United Nations been able to do anything? I mean, what do you think of the utility of the system of the United Nations? And I explained exactly what you're talking about now, which is that this is a system that is made up of countries in competition with each other, each holding a veto power. I said has become a system of lowest common denominator. Whatever the low-hanging fruit is, whatever the lowest common denominator is that everyone can agree on, sure, then the Security Council is great. You issue statements and resolutions and things happen. But the minute that something happens that one of these veto-wielding members does not want to happen, or it's against their interest for it to happen, or they're just competing with each other. I will veto your resolution because I want to show you that you don't have control over me. This happened a lot with Russia and the US during the Syria civil war. So you've explained or highlighted the weakness of the international community and its response and the system itself. You've highlighted your conversations with policymakers who, again, I'll tell you, it's a very familiar refrain to me when you say, sorry, we just don't have the personnel to actually literally deal with this in the Foreign Office or in the State Department. In a way, there is some truth. I always say policy is personnel, policy is people. It is true that if you have 2 people working on Sudan at the Foreign Office, then you may not be able to do everything that you need to do. But, and this is a huge but here, but that all falls to the wayside if you decide to prioritize an issue. If you decide that this issue is a priority, you will put resources to that issue and you will assign personnel to that issue because it is a priority. And so what you're saying is that for the last 18 months, as people were warning about this and showing evidence of what was happening and what was about to happen, that still countries did not prioritize this issue and allowed what is happening today to happen. And I think that's really shameful. But there's another element, Khulud, that I think factors into this, which is there are several reasons why countries don't act. One, we just talked about, they just don't deem it a priority. The other is when too many actors have too much to gain or to profit, right? Whenever we look at conflicts like this, there tends to be a reason why it is allowed to continue. And it's because people are profiting, or countries are profiting, or organizations are profiting. So I wonder if you could share with us, who are the beneficiaries that you see of this carnage that we're seeing and what's in it for them? I think you already talked about internally, the maintaining grip on power and maintaining the sort of militaristic system of governance. Who else is benefiting from this?
But the short answer is a lot of countries. One of the reasons we're seeing, the multilateral order falter on Sudan is because there are too many member states of crucial institutions that are pulling things in one way or the other, which means that you can't get much consensus on a sort of singular way to act or a singular policy. These multilateral institutions, whether it's the United Nations, the African Union, the League of Arab States, or the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, that's the regional bloc that Sudan is a part of in East Africa, all of these institutions are being undermined by their member states because these member states don't want to have any kind of regional oversight over their activities. But there are also institutions that undermine themselves. If you look at the secretariat within these institutions, particularly the United Nations, the African Union, there's not much political will by the people who are in charge of particularly this peace and security files to actually do anything to get the sign-off of the member states. And that is going to be a huge problem because actually, if you look at the conflicts that are going on in the world, Sudan is the only conflict where multilateral institutions can have something of a say. It's not like Russia and Ukraine where you have, as sort of sitting a member of the P5 that isn't part of it. It's not like Israel-Palestine where you have the United States being such an influential and large stakeholder in it, etc. It is a country where you could get international consensus. And actually, that's what we had seen in previous years. 20 years ago, Russia and China signed on to a peacekeeping mission on Sudan. Russia and China signed on to referral to the ICC of Omar al-Bashir and 4 others who were accused of genocide. This time around, we don't even see that. We don't even see these institutions really coming up with the kinds of policies that they could take to member states. So to me, the decline of multilateralism, when we post-mortem of these multilateral institutions is done, the cause of death will have been assisted suicide. They are being very much disempowered, but they are also disempowering themselves. And so when you think about, who is involved in this, all of Sudan's neighbors, without exception, all 7 countries are involved in this war somehow. Egypt and Eritrea back the Sudanese Armed Forces. The Eastern government in Libya under Khalifa Haftar, Chad, Central African Republic, South Sudan, Ethiopia, all have a preference to some degree or other towards the RSF. And then you have countries further afield in the region, Uganda, Kenya, etc., that have also been implicated in the work of the RSF. The RSF, in fact, themselves recently launched a parallel government out of Kenya in February of this year. Everybody is somehow invested in this because Sudan is a country that straddles so many geostrategic zones. It's part of the sort of southern Mediterranean, extension of the southern Mediterranean. It's on the Red Sea. It's on the Sahel. It's in the Horn of Africa. It is very much a foothold for any country that has a preferential political partner there, or a preferred political partner there. It's a foothold into the rest of Africa. And so when we look at, for example, some of the key actors, the UAE outspends China in Africa, particularly in the Eastern Horn. And it sees Sudan very much as this foothold into the rest of Africa. And investment in Africa is a key part of the UAE's post-oil diversification plan. For the Saudis, they share a maritime border with Sudan, and they want to make sure that their preferred partner, in this case the Sudanese Armed Forces, is the one who is in charge of that Red Sea region, 1, to keep the UAE away, and 2, to safeguard their own trillion-dollar investments in NEOM and other parts of that western Saudi coastline. The countries like Egypt have had a long history in Sudan. The Egyptian regime or government in Cairo very much sees Sudan as an extension of its southern border, and it has always preferred the Sudanese Armed Forces as the guarantor of that southern border, even when the Sudanese Armed Forces was very overtly led by an Islamist regime under Omar al-Bashir. And so for the Egyptians, they now see that keeping the RSF at bay is also one way to keep Emirati, Ethiopian interests around the River Nile away from the centers of power. And so one way to think about this in terms of the international elements is, sort of the waterways, the Nile, and the Nile Basin, and then the Red Sea and the Red Sea Basin. And the countries that are involved in all of these have particular interests. So, for example, the Iranians want a base on the Red Sea. The Russians want a base on the Red Sea. You have global war really playing out in Sudan. When you look at the way that regional countries engage, so for example, Egypt and the UAE are sort of on the same side when it comes to Libya, but completely opposite sides when it comes to Sudan, mostly because of this who's the better security partner for either of them. But there's also the situation where the very concept of Sudan in this region is not seen, I think, in the same way by many countries. So I think countries like the United States, European countries, see Sudan as one unitary whole country that comprises 18 states and a combination of different political and economic landscapes. The Russians, for example, don't see that. They see Sudan as a territory that has various geostrategic interests to them. So it backs the rapid support forces in the western part of the country because of the Sahel policy of the Kremlin, but it backs the Sudanese Armed Forces on the Red Sea because of the Red Sea policy of the Kremlin. Wow. And it sees no issue with doing that because in the end its interests in both those zones, the Sahel and the Red Sea, get met. Wow. So it's also a problem of different countries not viewing Sudan the same. The United Arab Emirates, though it is a key political backer of the RSF, it also has very deep business deals and business interests with the Sudanese Armed Forces, particularly around gold. You have countries like Egypt that are, making a killing, quite frankly, because of the gold and the gum arabic and the cattle that is smuggled into Egypt that's helping to really buttress the ailing Egyptian economy. A lot of that gold that goes through Egypt also goes to the United Arab Emirates, where the world's largest gold markets are. So you see this from the outside might be a sort of a confusing picture, but if you look at it as this is inherently a Sudanese conflict. It is the breakdown of the Sudanese military and security state after Bashir, after losing its patron. And that devastating breakdown that is sucking in so many political actors, not just in Sudan, but in the surrounding and neighboring countries, is also drawing in predatory policies from nearby countries, whether that's Egypt or Saudi Arabia or Qatar or Turkey or Iran, the UAE. And the weakness of the Sudanese state, both before the war, but certainly now with the almost total collapse of the Sudanese state, is allowing these countries to come in and effectively pick off, like vultures, the scraps of the corpse that is Sudan today. And so dealing with sort of thinking about how to fix this conflict in Sudan, you first have to figure out how to fix the Sudanese problem first. And at the same time, think, how do you deconflict the interests of key actors in the region, Egypt, Saudi, the UAE, such that you can then find an accommodation on both those levels, the regional level and the domestic level. And that is an extremely tall order right now.
Absolutely. You've just gone right into a question that I wanted to ask you about that, because recently you shared an article written by a Sudanese journalist. His name is Ahmed Gouja, where he wrote, "It is not lost on me that these killings took place just as the RSF was participating in US-sponsored talks that some expected would produce a 3-month nationwide ceasefire." He goes on to say, "This is not the first time the RSF has launched offensives and committed horrific abuses against civilians while taking part in supposed peace negotiations, which it uses as political cover." He says, "The message the group is sending to the international community is unmistakable. We can sit with you at the table, but our killing machine will keep running, and you will still say that we are interested in peace." I read that and I just had chills, because it is so often the case where groups and countries that are so ruthlessly going after their own interests will pretend to sit at the negotiating table and say just enough or do just enough to relieve some of the pressure on them so that they can actually continue doing what they're doing. So that's happening right now. And so you yourself tweeted, "Everyone should recognize that the fight and talk scenario is upon us and will remain." So what I wanted to ask you was, why are international mediating efforts failing? How is it that these groups, that the RSF can say we're sitting at the table, but continue to do what they're doing? I think you partly answer that by talking about the support that they're getting from the region, from outside the region, internationally. Everyone is looking at Sudan free for all, like a Chinese menu, like pick what you want and go after it and support who you need to support to get it. Is that the only reason you think the mediation efforts are failing, or is there something else going on?
No, I think the main reason that the mediation efforts have not just failed, are not just failing this time, but have failed since the start of this war, is that there's been no leverage on the table against these groups whatsoever. And whatever leverage has been brought to the table is not very enticing. There are no incentive structures. There are no sort of sticks or carrots that are sort of tangible, that we can see that resonate with the warring parties. So, for example, there were reports that the U.S. envoy Mazad Boulos, promised General Burhan some mining deals, very much apropos with Washington these days, but some mining deals that American companies would come in. But of course, those mining deals really didn't go anywhere. We were expecting visits of these mining companies in Sudan not so long ago, and that never really happened. And so whatever promises are being made in the form of carrots are not really being followed through on. Not that I think that this is the right way to do it, but whatever efforts are being put on the table are not fully tangible. And so, of course, that is not bearing fruit. And then whatever sticks are on the table, sanctions is one thing, but they know how to evade that. They've been evading sanctions for decades. But, sort of serious political leverage being put on the table, we haven't seen much evidence of that. And when it comes to this idea of, sort of the what comes next, I don't think, for example, the Quad formation, the US, the Saudis, the Egyptians, and the Emiratis all agree and are committed to a shared vision in Sudan. Not that it's necessarily, up to them to decide, but they don't even have a sense of a shared idea of what comes next. So they released a statement on the 12th of September to say they want three things. One, they want a no more Muslim Brotherhood in any way, shape, or form. I think most people would agree with that. The Muslim Brotherhood were terrible for Sudan and for the region. They would say no SAF, no RSF to feature in a future political dispensation. Great. But then what is the alternative? What does that look like? They say civilian rule. Okay, which civilians? What does that look like? Are we sure? And they say things like there should be no foreign interference. Okay, fine. Does that mean that it's going to be pressure on the Emiratis to stop weapons going into Libya and Chad that will then go into the hands of the RSF? Not that I have seen. Are there efforts to stop US allies like Turkey and Egypt from giving military support to the Sudanese Armed Forces? Not that I have seen. All of those are very nice words, but unless they're backed up by action and leverage, it's really meaningless. And there's a naivete that I can see here, and Ahmed Guja is absolutely right to speak about this issue, which is that it's not just this time that the RSF have used mediation talks, their participation in mediation talks, as political cover. They did it before. Earlier this year, there were London talks in April at the anniversary of the start of the war. And at that same time, the RSF were raising and committing atrocities in the Zamzam camp, in an international internally displaced persons camp around el-Fasher. Somewhat years ago, in 2023, we saw genocidal acts against the Masali being committed while the RSF was part of the Jeddah talks. The US themselves then later designated those crimes by the RSF as genocidal. This playbook is very obvious by now, and countries that reportedly and ostensibly part of mediation to end the war should be able to spot these signs. Instead, what we get is a sort of playing along and allowing the RSF to game the system. The Sudanese Armed Forces, on the other hand, have just always said no talks or mediation avenues, even ones where they signed. There was a mediation in Manama, the capital of Bahrain, the spring of 2024. The Sudanese Armed Forces representative signed, and by the time he came back to Port Sudan, the Islamists within the Port Sudan sort of regime had disavowed it, and that ceasefire went nowhere. And I think the international community needs to be a lot more wise to two things. One, the way that the RSF have gamed the system and will continue to play the international community for fools, particularly around the atrocity crimes. And two, the role of the Islamists and how much influence they have over the Sudanese Armed Forces, and therefore how much it is the Islamists' interest around keeping this war going as long as possible so that they can find an open door and return to power that is very much guiding a lot of the political calculus of the Sudanese Armed Forces. And unless those two things are reckoned with, we're not going to be able to see much traction in the mediation space. But also climatically, there is also a set of conditions right now that make it quite difficult to achieve a ceasefire, especially without that leverage, which is that it's the beginning of the dry season. And the dry season historically is the fighting season. So until June of next year, where we're going to see the next rainy season, no side is going to see a need to either sign a ceasefire, much less stick to it. And so what we have here is a situation where the international community is ignoring some of the main drivers on either side, political drivers, some of the main actors, like the Islamists. It's ignoring the fact that it's dry season. And all of those things mean that whatever efforts they're currently putting in, they need to put a lot more of it in. And they're just not doing that. And then people always ask me, well, why isn't the US putting pressure on the United Arab Emirates to stop at least bringing in weapons into Darfur to support the RSF, because after all, that is also in contravention of the Darfur arms embargo that was put in place 20 years ago and is still in effect was recently renewed, and that the US is penholder on at the UN Security Council. And the answer is that for the relationship between the United States and the United Arab Emirates, Sudan is not actually a high-ranking issue at all. There are much greater issues as far as both capitals see of, for example, security in the Middle East in relation to Israel and Palestine, for example, or data and crypto deals that were recently inked between President Trump and the ruling family in Abu Dhabi. And there are other, sort of issues related to security files, related to Somalia, where both the United States and the United Arab Emirates are engaged in military campaigns against the al-Shabaab jihadi group. And so when you think about sort of where Sudan ranks in the list of priorities of the US and the UAE, it's not very high. And this comes despite the fact that Congress has been putting a lot of pressure on the administration not to sign new weapons deals with the UAE until the US has made sure, the administration has made sure that those weapons will not go and get into the hands of the RSF. That hasn't really moved forward either. Unfortunately, the lay of the land currently is that Washington, D.C. is not interested in safeguarding life. Otherwise, it wouldn't have cut USAID, the main vehicle that it has to save lives in terms of AIDS, in terms of hunger, famine prevention, in terms of healthcare provision, etc. around the world. So we're entering a period not just of transactional foreign policy, but where the sanctity of life is being undermined on a daily basis. And within that context, it has been quite difficult for so many of us to advocate keeping people alive. That should be front and center of conversations that are being had amongst these interested groups.
It's so interesting. I mean, I'm sure many people who are listening to this would be asking, wait, but so the people who, some of whom are responsible for fueling this conflict are also the same countries that are responsible for trying to bring an end to the conflict? I mean, how does that make sense? And I guess what you said, that the countries are going to have to come to an accommodation amongst themselves as to what common vision they might have, so that then that translates on the ground in terms of their actions and their support and their involvement. So it's not necessarily these four countries coming in and trying to impose something on these two warring parties. They are part of the conflict. So they also have to decide amongst themselves how to bring this to an end and how to come some sort of agreement. But I know I've kept you a long time, and I'm so grateful for how much time you've given us, Khulud. I still have so many more questions, but I think end on what can be done. And I mean that in from two different perspectives. One is, you just brought up a lot of questions about the future. What civilian entity, what arrangement, how can civil society get involved? So there's the sort of internal, what happens next and what you would be recommending to policymakers. But then there's also, I think, for people who are watching this unfold on their television screens, on social media, and just feel so helpless and so heartbroken and want to do something to support. Right? I mean, I know you had mentioned earlier volunteer-led mutual aid groups in Sudan, including the emergency response rooms, ERRs, which were nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, who've been providing a lifeline to so many.
Yeah, so I think there are several things. And actually, when it comes to crises the size of Sudan's, it's not, the policy and the public element of it is not so distinct. And I think we saw this very much on Gaza, which is that public pressure really can force political change. And I think we need to see something like that in Sudan in order to force the kind of political change that we need to see, frankly, to bring this war to an end. And I think what we have here is now, because of what's going on in el-Fasher, and was effectively a line-streamed genocide and massacre and series of massacres, we are seeing the sort of flash in the pan media attention. But we need to see this consistently, because even after things sort of abate in el-Fasher, Sudan will still continue to be the world's largest hunger, displacement, humanitarian and protection crisis. International sort of financial and aid envelopes shrinking. It is going to be a question of, how do we continue to make sure that there's enough funding for what's going on in Sudan, just because of the scale of the needs. And in a way, the answer to those things is similar. We need the international community, that's publics around the world as well as governments, to champion the real drivers of peace in Sudan, the real drivers of any kind of liberation in Sudan, which is that these are going to be the civic actors, the civil society groups, the mutual aid groups like the emergency response rooms and others. And these are the ones who are right now, as we speak, the only semblance of a state that exists in Sudan in terms of provision of services, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of provision of safety, are these mutual aid groups, whether it's the doctors' groups that are running free clinics or the emergency response rooms that are running communal kitchens to feed people during a famine. These are the people who are effectively, performing the duties of a state. We don't have, I hear this from people on the ground all the time, we don't have anyone performing these duties on the ground. But there are also the people who are weaving together the social fabric that this war has ripped apart. So you're seeing these groups also trying to get people from different communities who are ethnically on different sides of this conflict, trying to get them together to make sure that the enmity does not, filter down all the way to them at the neighborhood level. They're trying to keep their communities together, trying to keep their communities safe, advocating for them is probably the surest way of ensuring that Sudan's future can actually be drafted and written by the right people, rather than those in uniform, rather than those in the Gulf or in Egypt or elsewhere. It does need to be the Sudanese people that decide what their future looks like. It cannot be written in Abu Dhabi. It cannot be written in Cairo. And in order for that to happen, these civic groups, these civic actors that are the backbone of life and society in Sudan, they are the ones who need to be empowered and emboldened as much as possible. And right now that is very, very difficult. So we need public advocacy around this to be specifically on supporting and funding these groups. And so what can people do? They can go to Mutual Aid Sudan, or they can go to the Sudan Solidarity Collective, both of them online, and they can give money if they want to. They can send it to their friends. Christmas is coming up. People can give donations. Ramadan is coming up not so long after that. People can give their donations there as well and help feed people, help keep people alive. But public pressure has proved vital. We have seen this very much be very successful on Gaza. And when it comes to Sudan, there has been a surge of support for Sudan, but people are still sort of unable to, I think, understand where the fault lines are. And, people say to me, even policymakers say to me, God, Sudan is just so complex. We don't know how to understand it. But actually, ordinary people have shown a greater capacity to understand political complexity, oftentimes, than policymakers. So actually, I have no doubt that ordinary people can rest with the political complexity in Sudan and make up their own minds about actually who the right people to champion here. And to my mind, those are ordinary people. Those are civic actors. It's not anybody wearing a uniform and wielding a gun. And we have seen that level of complexity really be, wrestled with and really be engaged with on things like Gaza, but also further afield. And I think we need to see something like that really sort of manifest right now on Sudan, but also be sustained. My biggest concern now is that what's going to happen when the RSF stops taking videos of its atrocities and posting them online? Will people just sort of turn away from el-Fasher and turn away from Sudan as a whole? I think there needs to be a way of sustaining that momentum as much as possible, but with the recognition that oftentimes the story that is told, which can be quite simplistic, is not the whole story. And there does need to be much greater engagement with the political dynamics in Sudan to really help tell that story and really help guide the advocacy in the right direction.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I'm going to include those recommendations in the show notes if people want to take a look at them. I know also, Khulud, that you have talked about both the disproportionate impact of these wars on women and girls, and also the need to include women in any political process moving forward. So I just wanted to make sure that people know that, and to see if you wanted to add anything to that, because I think that element of it is really important. And whether you know of any organizations that are also directly doing work to support women and girls.
Yeah, so I think, thank you for bringing that up. I think one thing that should be understood is that this war is being fought on the bodies of women and girls. I mean, when you hear the stories from the ground, from human rights documenters, from women's rights groups on the ground, you see very much that within the context of the broader war, that sexual violence is being used as a weapon of war. So when we talk about a ceasefire, that also needs to be a cessation of sexual violence being used as a weapon of war. It must mean safety for women and girls primarily, but also men and boys who are subjected to sexual abuse. And what we have seen recently, the one positive thing that I think we have seen from the international community is that during the renewal of the sanctions regime on Darfur, we saw that conflict-related sexual violence, or CRSV, was added as a sanctionable offense, effectively, to that sanctions regime. That is a huge opportunity right there that I think more people within the policy space need to be looking at in regards to the sexual violence that we're seeing. The emergency response rooms aren't just feeding people. There are also women's response rooms, and they help women sort of get over the stigma or engage with the stigma that they face after being sexually abused and raped. They help women get aftercare after rape, because frankly, there are very few entities that are able to provide such services. They help women and girls really try to sort of forge a life for themselves after undergoing, any kinds of abuse. For example, livelihoods opportunities, or for younger women to go back to university or school. I think the ERRs and mutual aid groups in general are the ones that are the backbone of this response. Of course, there are international organizations that work on this, even national level non-governmental organizations that work on this. But where we're seeing the most impact right now is through these grassroots movements, is through, for example, the Sudanese American Physicians Association, or SAPA, which is help women and girls, especially who have been abused and raped, to also get access medical care and get medication, etc. So if you look, I think, at the local picture, if you look at those who work on the ground, there is so much that can be supported and needs to be supported. And you're absolutely right. The research has shown that in peace processes and peace agreements where women are part of the conversation, part of the negotiations, those are statistically much more significantly able to last 5 years or more than when women are not engaged. And we have seen this actually play out in Sudan. Every peace agreement that we've had has been led by men, and men in uniform has either deteriorated or broken apart or ironically led to more conflict. So we really need to do things differently. We know that these have been trialed elsewhere, Liberia, Sierra Leone, other parts of the world, Colombia too, I believe. Bringing that into the conversation around ceasefire and conversation around peace processes needs to be central. And in all my conversations with diplomats and policymakers from all over the world, whether that's on the continent of Africa, in the Middle East, or in the West, that is never a conversation that is brought up unless I bring it up or others bring it up. There's not this sense that even though the research shows very clearly that women have to be part of the mediation political talks, there's no sense that this is even a nice to have, let alone an essential thing. And that conversation needs to change very quickly.
Absolutely. I'm glad you said that and made it so clear, and I really hope it resonates. So, Khulud, thank you again so much. I genuinely appreciate how much time you've given us. It's really not easy to talk about all of this, let alone work on it, but the work that you do is so important, and I'm grateful that you came on to talk about it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yasmin, and thank you for covering Sudan.
I hope you found that conversation insightful and learned some things you didn't know before. If you'd like to support our work moving forward, please don't forget to follow us wherever you get your podcasts, subscribe to our videos on YouTube, and leave a comment and review to make sure we know what you're thinking. You can also always email us at jasmine@viewfromherepod.com. That's jasmine@viewfromherepod.com. As always, thank you so much for listening. I'm Jasmine El Gamal, and this is The View From Here.